This program is brought to you by the Center for a Sustainable Today. Our world is an amazing, complex living organism, and we coexist in a symbiotic relationship. With this great power comes a great responsibility, a responsibility to ensure the future by taking steps to be sustainable today. And now here are the hosts of Sustainable Today.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us again. So glad to have everybody on the show. I'm Darcy Hitchcock.
And I'm Marcia Willard. And tonight's program is on wind power. And we have a couple of esteemed guests with us here in the studio tonight. I want to introduce first Rachel Shimshak from Renewable Northwest. That's a nonprofit group here in our area that's been instrumental and rather successful in pushing renewable energy in the area.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Happy to have you.
And we also have Troy Gagliano with enXco, and they develop major wind projects. So it'll be very interesting to hear what's involved with that, since obviously that's a growing field. So thanks for coming on the show with us. Oh, absolutely.
And we're eager to hear what you have to say. But first, we want to cover some of the news that's happened in the last month or so.
Boy, has it been a busy month.
Nobel Prizes and things like that?
Yeah, really. Well, one of the most exciting things for me was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with their new information, their latest report, and Scientific American did a nice summary of that. And it's kind of alarming. They're saying that there's a 90% chance that heat waves will get worse. There's a 90% chance that extreme precipitation events like heavy rains will happen more. A 66% chance of drought. You know, I was back east for a while and it was very dry back there. So it's really interesting to see what's coming out. What's encouraging, though, is that 130 nations, including the United States, bless our hearts, have basically concurred with it. So there's a lot of support for it at this point. It's waking people up.
Well, yes, there's a lot of support, and we're molasses movement toward that. I was reading the news about the Bali conference, which is the UN conference that occurred recently in Bali, the UN climate conference. And there were 180 nations there, and together they created a roadmap for greenhouse gas reductions in response to what the Intergovernmental Panel produced. It's interesting to note that originally they were shooting for some very specific targets and language in the report, somewhere between 25 and 40% reductions over our 1990 carbon emission levels. And remember that Kyoto only wanted 5%. So that says
but the
a lot
scientists say 90%. So
well, but I'm just remarking about how far we've come. If we
Yes.
had implemented Kyoto, in the 90s, maybe we wouldn't be having these drastic measures. But of course, the U.S. objected to those numbers, those specific targets. So now it's really just sort of a vague suggestion about reductions. So.
Well, at least business is getting on board. I find that really encouraging. A few years ago, nobody in mainstream media would use the S word as what they referred to sustainability as. But recently, the Wall Street Journal, this is my high watermark, the Wall Street Journal had an article about socially responsible investing. And they use the term sustainability and don't even feel it necessary to explain it. It's right here along with those surveyed, cited
like it's a
corporate
regular
governments,
word.
globalization, climate change, sustainability, and access to clean water as top issues. It's like, hallelujah, we don't even have to explain it anymore. So I think that's great. What about you?
Well, similarly, in the investment community, what we're finding is that there was a recent USA Today study that showed that 70%, I think that's a remarkable number, 70% of investors check a company's track record, their environmental and sustainable track record before investing, and 57% have changed an investment based on environmental and social performance of the companies that they're investing in.
You kind of wonder what the others are doing.
Well, I might be one of them myself. Although all of us that have money in our retirement funds that don't monitor,
Sure.
So I think that's a huge number. And the other thing I noticed was I discovered this ad in one of the weekly news journals, and it caught my attention primarily because it's a beautiful picture, but when I looked at it, it was completely unclear what product they were advertising. It is Canon, I had to read the fine print to understand that they're talking about the copiers, but it's all about how they're reducing their greenhouse gas footprint, their CO2 reduction, and I think that's very telling that this is a company that's selling their product not by mentioning the product, but by mentioning their behavior, their environmental behavior. I think that's very, very compelling.
Also, recently in Oregon, wasn't there that business leadership summit? What happened there?
Yes, that was real interesting. Oregon holds a leadership conference, and these are the elites in our state, the movers and the shakers who come together, and what they're talking about is economic development. And what was interesting is that they focused on just a couple of leverage points for the state. Transportation, land use planning were a couple of them, but right up there with those two other issues were things like the importance and the value in making Oregon a center for learning about sustainability, that could have economic advantage to the state. That and leveraging our expertise in green building and renewable energy technologies, which we'll hear about, and recycling technologies. And the one that was really most interesting was developing a market for ecosystem services.
Oh, I think that's great. We'll have to
figuring out how to value those and charge for them.
We'll have to have a show on that one of these days, and I know just who to invite on.
Okay.
But in addition to business, government's also doing things. The Australian new Prime Minister,
That's
Kevin
right.
Rudd, the moment he got into office, he signed the Kyoto Agreement, which leaves the U.S. as the, I think, only developed nation hanging out there saying we won't sign, which is interesting. The Herald Tribune covered that.
Well, I think I'd also heard it was not only one of his key platforms, but the reason that the incumbent didn't do so well in the election was because he refused to. I was looking more locally here in Portland, got a lot of attention at the recent Green Build Conference in Chicago, where they announced a carbon fee system related to building fees. So the plan is to penalize new construction, penalize those builders and those buildings that don't implement dramatic energy reduction measures, and to give credits and fee rebates to those who do. So, you know, we talk a lot about a carbon tax. That, I don't know if that technically is one, but we'll see it start to enter the economy in varying ways, I think.
And once again, the Northwest is in the lead.
Yeah, well, we like to think so.
Yeah, that's great. So on to the show. So Rachel, thank you so much for coming on board. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what our Renewable Northwest Project does? I know you've been very instrumental in helping us move toward renewables, but I don't have a clue how you do your work. So fill us in.
The Renewable Northwest Project is a regional nonprofit organization. We promote solar, wind, and geothermal in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana.
Okay.
Those are the states that are sort of connected because the Bonneville Power Administration serves them and the Northwest Power Planning Commission also serves them. And we're connected through a grid. We have members that are quite diverse. Our membership includes energy companies, the ones that actually build and manufacture parts for renewable energy facilities, and environmental and consumer groups. It's the one place where consumer and environmental folks get together with business and work toward a common goal. We have 3 strategic objectives. One is to get good projects in the ground, so we do a lot of work on siting. We work on policies that promote renewables, help reduce barriers and make more renewables happen. And we also work on the retail green power market, so people like you and I and businesses can buy green power directly and go beyond what their utilities are doing for them up to 100% of their needs.
And even Northwest Natural has a green power option. You know, I've
That's
been
right.
buying green power through my electric utility for quite a while, but I was really pleased to see Northwest Natural get on board as well.
The utilities in the Northwest, and particularly in Oregon, really pioneered the ability for customers to choose their own green power product and are constantly improving those products over time. So we're quite proud of them, and in the whole nation, we always come out in the top 10 in terms of penetration, the number of customers who are signing up to use those programs.
We love hearing that. Well, now your counterpart, you're a nonprofit. Now we have for-profit. Troy, would you tell us something about your organization?
I'm with enXco, and we're an energy company, a member of Renewable Northwest Project. We develop renewable energy projects across the country and internationally. Not just wind, but wind has been our focus, and have been involved with wind power since 1987, but also some small hydro and biomass and geothermal and solar projects in the future as well.
In 20 states, right? Isn't that what you told
Correct,
me?
20 states in the U.S.
That's great. That's wonderful. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what's involved with building large-scale wind installations? Got to be really complicated. Tell us the process a little bit.
It can be, sure. You need several things to make a wind project, for example, really work. You need a wind resource, obviously, that's strong enough to make it economic.
That's the wind.
The
Okay.
wind resource. Then you need land that's accessible, so you can actually get trucks up there and equipment and operations and maintenance crews. You also need fairly close access to transmission lines. Transmission lines are sort of like if you're at the Port of Seattle and want to get your product, you need to ship it over interstates.
Yeah.
And transmission lines get the electricity to market. So you need the transmission lines fairly close by. You also need willing landowners who are, wanting to participate in a project. You need permits, a host of permits for environmental issues, air quality, noise, a whole host of things. And then, of course, you need the wind turbines themselves. So it's a lot of things going on. And that's only really the development piece. After that, you have the whole construction crew that gets together and makes things happen from there.
And
Wow.
do you participate in putting all that package together to make
I
that
work
happen?
more on the permitting side, working with the communities to make sure that they know about the project and everybody has some say and some influence on the project, because once a wind project is in the ground, it's there for 20 years. So our company wants to do the right thing, and we want to work with this community from early on. Nobody likes surprises, so we work with the community, and I also work a lot with the permitting piece of it as well. But we have another construction crew that does all of that work.
So talk us through the construction process. The blades aren't made locally, right? I think a lot of the blades are made in Denmark, is that right? So where are they coming from, and how do they get here, and how do they get to these fairly remote areas? Walk us through
Good
the
question. I'll
construction.
say a little bit, and I'm sure Rachel can add on
Yeah,
to
both
some.
of you. Jump in.
One company that's here in Portland, Oregon is Vestas, and they're
Right.
a Danish company and one of the top names in wind turbine manufacturing. General Electric got into the game of manufacturing wind turbines about 6 years ago. So yeah, you've got the design of the blades and the towers and things. It's international. The towers can come from some other countries where the steel might be made. We're starting to see more facilities in the United States making turbines in Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Colorado. So the wind industry kind of grew really grew internationally more than in the U.S. But it's great to see a lot more manufacturing capability happening domestically now as well.
I was just going to add that there's a whole bunch of food groups that participate in making a wind project happen. So when Troy's mentioning that the blades are coming from overseas, even though some of the rest of the component parts may be coming from other places in the United States, that's created a lot of jobs for the Port of Vancouver, for instance. And they have an agreement with Vestas that, over the course of 3 years, they'll have so many turbines come in. So it's quite exciting, actually, to go to the port and to look at all the turbines lined up on the side there. They have so much business that they actually went out and spent $23 million and bought a new crane just to unload the
Wow.
turbines from the boats to the shore and put them on trucks to get them out of there. So a lot of jobs for longshoremen, truckers getting the stuff to the sites. Once you're working on a site, you need everything from lawyers and environmental consultants and developers and construction crews and electricians, and then the local places that are sponsoring these projects. One of the counties, for instance, has only one restaurant, so everybody goes to a restaurant. So they added on because they had a lot of activity. So it's quite a very important economic story as well as an environmental story.
I don't think we were the only ones that were apprehensive about what was going to happen, because we never had it happen. But it was an interesting experience.
How do you feel about them now?
Bring them on.
You want more?
Oh yeah.
So you're talking a lot about what's happening here in terms of the expansion, and this must be because wind is growing as an energy source. The rumor we hear is it's the fastest growing renewable energy technology. So is that true, and do you see that playing out, and do we have enough wind to capture all this? And
Wind has grown at a pretty phenomenal rate, a neighborhood of 20% a year the last 5 or 6 years. And a lot of that is because the cost of electricity generated from wind power is competitive with traditional resources. And another great thing about electricity from wind turbines is that it's a stable and predictable price. Because once you spend the money and do everything up front with the capital to put the turbine in the ground, you're not buying fuel for the next 20 years. So the fuel is essentially free.
And so it's competitive now, even before the implementation of a possible carbon tax that's going to hit coal-fired plants pretty hard.
That's right. It's been especially popular in the Northwest, and we've seen a terrific amount of activity in the market here, partially because people here really care about their environment. They care about the quality of life. They care about being sustainable, and they want to see their utilities supply them with sustainable power. Policies that have been implemented have helped ensure that a growing amount of renewables are in our energy supply. You know, Troy talked about the stability in price. That's a really important thing, because if you look at a gas plant, for instance, it's cheaper to build, but you take the risk and the volatility of fuel prices along the way. When you build a renewable resource, you know what the cost is up front, and over the long term, it's very stable. So it's a good thing to have in your portfolio. So there are a lot of reasons, you know, price, stability, Oregon, you know, quality of life considerations, lots of things that are making this happen.
You know, it sounds great, and I always want to play devil's advocate just to make sure that we're looking at both sides here. So there have been concerns about bird kills and some other sorts of problems. So where are we with that? Has the new technologies eliminated that problem? Is it less of a problem? What environmental issues are still out there that we need to be concerned about?
I think that the wind industry, as a general matter, learned a very important lesson from one unfortunate project in California that was built in the 1980s. When we were in the process of testing different kinds of resources, the Altamont Pass in California was really the place to go. There were 7,000 wind turbines. They represented 20 different kinds of designs and companies, and and the siting process wasn't very well developed then. I think we learned a lot about where you should put projects and where you shouldn't put projects, and I'm happy to say that all the projects that exist in the Northwest have a pretty good track record. In addition, you mentioned the new technology. Turbines are bigger and slower than they used to be, and instead of having lattice towers that bird likes to sit on, they have tubular towers, so there's no real place for the birds to perch anymore. So the technology has helped, but I really think that the siting activities, we've learned a lot over a long period of time, and we're a lot better at that, so we have a better track record.
Now, Oregon's been doing things to promote this, and there have been things happening in the legislature to help make this happen. Talk a little bit about the importance of that and what they've done, what other communities should do. 2007
was a banner year, especially in Oregon, for legislative issues. There were several really important pieces of legislation. I think the most critical is what's called the Renewable Energy Standard. Essentially says that a utility generating electricity in the state or selling electricity in the state has to have a certain percentage of that be renewable by a certain year. So in Oregon, it's 25% has to be by 2025.
Okay.
And
So
Oregon
25
joined.
by 25.
Right.
Easy to remember.
Oregon joined a couple other states have done that as well, but I think it's about 25 states now, 24 or 25, so almost half of the country have similar policies. And the Renewable Energy Standard is a critical one because it really helps us focus more on using our domestic resources. Because the wind that blows across farmlands or the sun that shines down all over is a domestic resource. No one can threaten to cut that off. And so that's one of the real big things in several years why people are really moving more towards renewables. The cost is great, but it's sort of a self-sufficiency thing. You know, we've got these resources here in our state, in our homeland, let's use them. So that Renewable Energy Standard was a big one. There's also some really important tax credits that were expanded for all renewables. Those will be especially helpful for solar. So Oregon this year, I think, is a great model in terms of public policy that was passed that other states could look to.
Plus, I think utilities would tell you that they like certainty. They like to know what the landscape's going to look like over the long term because they're making investments that will last 30 or 40 or 50 years. If the state is clear about its policy and says, we want you to have a growing amount of renewable energy in your energy supply, and here are the dates by which you have to have this amount, that gives them a planning target, and then they can go and make decisions to do those kinds of things. So having long-term positive energy policy is a really good thing. The federal government also has an important role to play, and the federal government has a production tax credit that's been very important to the development of wind projects over the last probably 5 to 10 years. And we're hoping that the federal government, in its wisdom, will have a long-term extension of that policy as opposed to a bunch of short-term extensions. That sort of causes havoc in the market. The fossil fuel guys, they get their tax credits embedded in the tax code in perpetuity. So we'd like to see a long-term policy so we know what direction the country should go.
Leveling the playing field.
Yeah.
What we'd like to do now is to move to a spot that we've got. While large-scale commercial wind farms produce the bulk of wind-generated power, it's possible for almost anyone to set up their own wind generator. We have proof positive in our community spotlight. Warren and Elizabeth Griffin live near Salem and have one of the first private homes to use both wind and solar to reduce their energy consumption. Will George paid a visit to the Griffins' home to find out how they are leading the way to Oregon's energy future.
I'm Will George, and today we're out near Salem on a nice little spread of land that is quite interesting, owned by Elizabeth and Warren Griffin.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Thanks. Hey, this is really an interesting little piece here. It looks like kind of like a wind turbine. Is that what it is?
Yes, it is. This is our wind tower or wind turbine, affectionately known as Windy Boy. And we're pretty proud and looking forward to sharing some information about it with you.
Great. So, what exactly is this wind unit? How does the wind unit work?
Well, there's several different types of installations that can happen with a wind turbine. You can have a fixed pole, or you can have a pole that can be lowered. And for ease of servicing and maintenance, we decided to go with the system that allows for the lowering. So we have a base pole, which is called a gin pole, which acts as a support as it's being lowered. And it's lowered just by a hand crank. And they can lower it all the way to the ground and do whatever servicing or maintenance needs to happen, and then raise it back up.
How tall is it?
106 feet.
You ever have any issues with lightning?
We did. Not a direct hit. It was, they're not exactly sure what happened, but it was affected by lightning about a year ago. So that required sending the alternator in to be rewound. And after that, we installed a series of units that are like surge protectors so that it won't happen again.
How often do you have days when there's no wind?
Usually
Not very many,
in the
actually.
winter, especially.
Yeah, actually most days it blows some. I think it's rare to have a day where we look at a Windy Boy and nothing's been generated.
What's the least amount of wind that it takes to turn that thing?
Well, it can turn at very small amounts of wind, but it won't generate until down to, it takes at least 6 miles per hour to generate electricity.
It goes through a startup process. So the wind has to be high enough for at least a few minutes for it to go through its startup process. It makes me think of, you know, when you're going online, when you've seen those movies and they're going online at some power station and there's this whole process of starting up and the lights come on the inverter and flick in a certain order, and then once it's been going for a minute or two, then it's actually online generating.
What's so unique about this emitter?
Actually nothing. This is the same meter you have in anybody's house. And this is where PG comes every month and takes a reading, and they send us a bill.
It has two different displays for it. The first is our usage, how much we've used on a monthly basis. And then it also displays how much has gone back into the grid, back into the system. This number right here is the total number of kilowatts that we have used in the house since electricity came on. And this number is the total number of kilowatts that have gone back into the grid. And when PGE figures our bill, they give us a credit for the amount that we've put back into the system.
All right, let's go inside to take a look at the inverters. All right. Could you tell us what these things are? Just kind of basically describe them, how they work, and what they do.
These are the inverters, and they take the DC current generated by the solar panel and the wind turbine and convert it to AC power, which is what we use in our home. This is the inverter for the solar system, and this is the inverter for the wind system. The energy is generated at the site out there at the units, and they come into the house in a conduit as direct current. They come in through this wire as a DC. They're converted into AC within these units, and they exit as AC here and here. They go to our panel right there, which is the panel you'd have in anybody's normal house. When we need to use energy for our needs, it's used right there at that point, just as in anybody's house. What we're not using at that point keeps on going out to the meter, and it goes back out into the grid to be used by somebody else. But when we're using electricity, we have a washing machine on and our dryer and our heater all at the same time. Of course, we're drawing energy. It comes in from the outside, in through our panel, and out to our appliances. This unit up here is where excess energy goes if it's blowing so hard outside that the amount of DC current coming in is overwhelming Windy Boy's ability to convert it to AC. The energy is then shunted up there and it becomes heat.
So we are in a situation here where if the grid goes down that services our home, we are down as well, even if it's windy, even if it's sunny, because these are powered electrically, and the conversion process is electric, and so the trade-off for being on the grid is that we do go down if the grid goes down.
Right. But the benefit is we can get by without having to use batteries.
Right.
Which you felt was a very environmentally unfriendly option. It only produces within a certain range of voltages. When there's no wind or very little wind, less than 6 miles per hour, it can generate the voltage up to I think it's 160, to where this begins to actually generate electricity. And if it's blowing too fast, which is very, very rare, the voltage coming in becomes more than 360, and this thing protects itself, and it sends a signal up to Windy Boy to feather itself and stop producing. On that very, very windy day we had a few weeks ago, when all the trees came down, all the power went out, I was watching this go, and it would generate for 10 minutes and then be offline for 5 minutes, and then 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off, as the gusts would kick it above the ability to generate safely.
Right.
There's a display here that tells you, if you hit it, it comes on, and you can see your usage you've done in a 24-hour period, or at least from when this has turned on to when it turned off. Keep track of your daily usage. It cycles through another display where it shows you your yearly usage, so you can keep track of how many kilowatts you've generated per year.
And as far as Windy Boy, it looks kind of dead today. What's going on?
No wind.
There's no wind right now.
At the moment, and that's part of the issue with having a wind system. Some days we have great wind and it's generating 20, 30 kilowatts a day, and in some days we'll get very little.
So describe what it was like when you had these first hooked up.
Oh, we were all in here together, as a whole family, and we came home from work, and we all gathered around to watch Sunny Windy Boy start generating.
And there was no wind that day.
No wind the first day.
So how long did you stare at Windy Boy?
All day. Please, please. But it is nice in the wintertime when it's really stormy and it's really freezing outside and nothing's happening with Sunny Boy to watch Windy Boy just cranking away.
Just you can give me round about ballpark figures. How much did the total thing cost about?
Buying the equipment and installing the equipment was about $25,000. And over the course of the payback, which is over 5 years for the wind, we'll get about, it's a little over half, isn't it? A little over half gets back directly from grants from Energy Trust. Plus we have ongoing tax credits that we get from the state.
Without the Energy Trust and the tax credits, it could be probably like 45, 50?
No, that's total cost was 25, just what we laid out to get all this stuff. And we got
not quite half of that back.
right up front.
Up front. And then over time through the tax credits, and we submit quarterly invoices to Energy Trust.
And actually, Energy Trust, they came out and looked at the site and gave us a lot of advice because they want these things to work as well. They don't want to pay money up front and have it not work because one, it's a waste of money, and two, it's a bad example.
We had an interesting experience with the county because they had never been, had a permit request for a residential wind turbine. And so they were supportive of it once they understood that we weren't trying to be our own little mini electric company.
And as far as your personal philosophy, did you do this because you want to be green, or is it because you want to make a difference for sustainability? I mean, what made you make that choice?
We did it because both reasons you mentioned. We want to have a small impact on the land, and we wanted to make a difference in where we live, and also set an example.
We just felt like it was a good thing to do. It was the right thing to do.
We figured that the main reason why we want to do it is not so much to make money off making electricity, but a reduced amount of carbon we're using while we live here.
Well, I really appreciate you having us out here today to see your great adventure in pioneering of wind and solar energy. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Will George, bringing you the tools to be sustainable today.
Well, that segment was a perfect segue into the second part of our interview section here, when we welcome a new guest to our table. I'd like to introduce Toby Kincaid of Solardyne, and you want to tell us a little bit about Solardyne and what your company does.
Well, thank you. Good to be with you. Well, renewable energy is now a very up-and-coming thing because it empowers people where they are. So really, we're on the verge of an industrial revolution, and that industrial revolution is based on economics. Now, if you look at energy today, you buy it from some third party, a utility, and they may give you some options for clean energy, but essentially you're at mercy to the market. And as we see, volatility means what's the price of electricity 5 years from now? We don't know.
Yeah,
Exactly.
who knows?
So it's very difficult to plan under any kind of circumstance. But now with clean energy technology, solar and wind, people who are consumers of energy can actually now be proactive and become their own producers of energy on site.
The old off-the-grid independence
That's right.
thing.
So instead of a volatile market price for energy, now it can become a fixed price. Because as mentioned, there is no fuel cost, there is no pollution, so you don't have that liability. Now you have an ability to make energy where you are in a way that you can predict over the cycle of your finance.
So a lot of people know about the big wind farms that we were talking about earlier in the show, but there have been new technologies that it seems like every time I turn around, somebody's saying, oh, there's this home-based unit that'll be ready in 6 months, and 6 months later it's still not ready yet. So bring us up to speed about where we are with technology now for people to be able to do wind on a community level or at their own house.
Well, it's improving a lot. And the major issue has been the power conditioning equipment. Because when
Explain power conditioning.
Okay. Well, let's start with what a utility is. Now, a wind farm is basically the same model as any other power plant. It's in a remote site. Then you have transmission and distribution to a consumer. We call T&D for the power lines. And then you have the consumer who pays for that commodity.
Right.
Well, there's now something called DG, distributed generation, which means that you're producing power where you're actually consuming it. So actually, this becomes almost a wireless utility in it's that your own, and you're not involved with the T&D, which is about 1/3 of the cost of a utility. So in maintaining substations and power lines and crews like that.
So you're not talking about net metering and that sort of thing?
Well,
You're
now
basically
we're leading into net
Okay.
metering, because when you have your own facility, your own distributed generation, which is where you are,
Right.
you can either be a standalone, which is where you're charging batteries and you're completely off grid, or you're grid tied. If you're grid tied, that means you have to interface with the grid wires because you're going to be putting power into the grid as well as consuming it. So this is where the improvement has been made in the actual hardware that connects you. It has to be UL listed, it has to be safe. If the power lines go down, then it disconnects itself, so no linemen are in any trouble. So this has been really the big push, is not only the use of the basic technology, but how it interfaces and how you can meter it. And we call that SCADA, System Control and Data Acquisition, which is a fancy way to say, what did I get out of it? So with net metering, this is really interesting, because under the law now, as you, for example, you look at your electric bill and you've consumed X number of kilowatt hours per month, if you have a qualifying facility, meaning that you meet all the rules and you're safely connected, then at the end of the month it measures how much did you put back into the grid against your consumption. So simply said, if you pull out 1,000 kilowatt hours, but over the month you put back 1,000 kilowatt hours, at the end of the month, what's your bill? 0. This is the essence of net metering.
Kind of like getting back your unused minutes on your cell phone.
Yes.
There's an
Absolutely.
idea
So-
out of
Actually,
it.
just like that. It's like running your meter backwards.
Right.
So to the extent that you're producing energy at your own home, the meter's running backwards, and when you're not, the utility's providing your power and it's running forward. So
And
at
I
the
would
end,
bet you were part of the legislation that made net metering have to happen, right?
Indeed.
She
And
is
I-
speaking knowledgeably, isn't she?
I was going to say the Utility Commission just increased the size of a system that you could have at your home or your business and net meters. So it went from a pretty small system to a pretty good sized system. So and having distributed power is very good for the system as a general matter. It
Okay,
helps
so-
it be reliable.
So how do I produce energy in my house?
Well, you have several choices, depending on what your situation is. If you have a good solar resource, photovoltaics, which are a little expensive on the front end, and we can deal with how we finance the system, that's one option. Wind has been traditionally another. And the really hot topic now is combining them, called a hybrid system. So when the sun comes up, the wind tends to go down. And when the wind at night goes down, or rather, the sun is coming up during the day, the wind is going down, but at night the sun is down, the wind is up. And this is a very complementary charging ability to export energy.
So how would I know whether my house or my town was the right place to do this?
Well, traditionally you would do a resource assessment. This would involve an anemometer, and an anemometer measures the wind speed. That's right.
The little cuppy thing.
That's right, and usually with a tail as well, and that tells you what direction the wind is coming and how much of it is coming.
Okay.
So that's generally the proper way to proceed. But really, with a lot of clients that I deal with on the small scale, because that's often expensive, and it's called a meteorological tower or a Met tower, you just ask, is it windy where you are? Is it sunny where you are? Now, obviously, if you're under the trees, maybe not a good place to put solar panels. But is it windy? And most people have an immediate response. And there's an old joke of people in the panhandle of Texas. They always wondered, why are they standing sideways? Well, it's when they walk outside, the wind pushes them upright again. Because there's so much wind in the panhandle of Texas.
Now, you actually brought some stuff into the studio with us. So why don't you show us a little bit about the equipment that you brought here and tell us how it works?
Okay, well, wind technology is based really on a propeller, traditional wind turbines, and the trend is to go larger and larger because you have larger economies of scale. Now, the one thing about propellers, and bless them, but they're really most appropriate for wind farms, which are remote, or ranchers, which have enough land to accommodate them.
And they can be noisy, right?
Absolutely,
And you get the yawing
absolutely, and issues of avian impact. This is something not well
Bird kills
discussed.
for
That's
the rest
right.
of us.
And really, there's two kinds of birds. Birds that have eyes on the side of their head are lunch. And they fly into anything, basically, because they're looking around for the predators. But it's the raptors, the owls, the eagles, they're binocular like we are. So when they're focused in on their prey, they just can't see this blade orthogonally coming down on them. They're very surprised birds.
And they like to perch on things and watch for things.
That's right. So it's very attractive for them to be in danger.
So show us what you've got. I want to understand.
So the premise is that a propeller is not really suitable for an urban environment, but most people live in urban environments.
Right.
And therefore, the only way to get clean energy is to buy it from a third party. This is the Helix wind technology. And this is an omnidirectional technology. It's not based on lift like a propeller, but it's based on a hybrid of drag and lift. And regardless of which way the wind spins, this will only spin one way. It's visible to the birds. And most importantly, this working surface is entirely silent.
It is quiet.
There is no sound. In a high wind, you're right next to it, you cannot hear it at all. And so to design this, what I thought is, well, we have to list all of the ideal characteristics of a wind turbine. Well, it would have to be silent, it would have to be robust, it has to be safe for the birds, it has to be maintainable, it has to be shippable, it has to be installable. In all of these issues, and of course, most important, it has to be affordable. So now in urban environments, wind is not very clean. When you have obstacles, it's very turbulent. And propellers just really don't do very well with that. Therefore, they often try and go as high as possible to get the clean air.
Right.
Okay, but that's not suitable for an urban environment. With this technology, because it has that surface area, much like a sail ship, I mean, you can take a 14-ton sail ship with an 18-foot mast and go, 8 knots through the water. That's an enormous amount of power.
Yeah.
Well, because you have that surface area to absorb it. So with this Helix wind turbine, you're able to, from the economic standpoint, make it very inexpensive because there's very few parts. But from a performance standpoint, it loves turbulent wind.
Oh, great. So how much, if I had one of those on my house, do I need special structural work on my house? Is it going to yaw and rip my roof to shreds or not?
Well, this is a good question. And my recommendation is you don't put wind turbines on buildings, on houses.
Okay.
I recommend you put them on poles on the side of the yard or around the outside of a footprint, so you're not really taking the space that you had available.
Okay.
So with a house, I say don't put it on the house.
So you mount it on a pole next to your house.
That's right.
Like that.
That's right.
And how much energy would that, how many light bulbs would I be able to run with that?
Well, this size would run a laptop computer, about 40 watts.
Really?
Yes.
40 watts, so that's a compact fluorescent bulb, right? Roughly.
No, several of them.
Several.
Compacts are usually around 10 watts, something like that.
Okay.
So, but you can see that the cross section of this device isn't particularly large. You can have it any color you want. It doesn't necessarily need to be this this particular color. I realize
it's not my favorite green.
It's kind of an algae green.
Yes, slime green is what I call it.
But this is something that you can deploy in a very turbulent environment, which is the case near the ground where people live. And now Portland State University has agreed to do a long-term testing for us so that we can quantify all of these issues.
So they're small enough that you could have a number of them.
Absolutely. We almost call that a wind wall.
A wind wall?
Well, but it's just essentially a deployment of several. And they could be, of course, any color or a picture of your kids or whatever you want to put on them. So it's a very human. It's interesting that 6,000 kids die every day in the world horribly because they drink bad water. Well, with 40 watts, you can run a UV water sterilizer and we can save those kids.
That's great.
Oregon is the pioneer state, and that's why really this is coming from Oregon.
So we always like to be the show that tells people what they can do at home, and maybe one place to start right before we go into that is to talk briefly about how much of our power can we get from wind in both the big scale and the small scale. Realistically, moving forward, what percentage do you think we're going to be able to shoot for?
What is it currently? What's the portfolio look like?
Even though we have made an incredible amount of progress in the last 10 years in the Northwest, we've gone from about 0 to about 2,000 megawatts. Each megawatt serves about 250 households, so it's a half a million households so far. The national labs think that we can meet about 20% of our needs with wind.
20%.
That's great. So, things that people can do at home. The first and most important thing that you can do is reduce your need for energy at all, because then you don't have to create as much. So, insulate your home, buy compact fluorescent bulbs, and etc. Another thing that you can do is calculate your carbon footprint, and carboncounter.org has a very simple one that I've done and is great. Another thing you can do is to sign up for wind power. If your electric utility has it, which certainly in Oregon we do, sign up for green power because it's likely to be wind power. So that's a very important thing. And when you've calculated your carbon footprint and after you've bought green power, then purchase carbon offsets for the remaining greenhouse gas impacts that you're having, and then you can be carbon neutral.
You can do similar things in the workplace. Oregon in particular, you alluded to a few of the federal tax credits. So as a business, you can look for finding energy savings and getting tax credits for them. Our program is called the Business Energy Tax Credit, or formerly known as BETC. You also might want to consider investing in your facilities. So thinking about, we've talked about LEED on the show before, but incorporating green design is a good way to save energy in your work facility place. You might want to also promote the fact that you're buying green power. So as a business, we see sometimes, I think utilities give you a decal you can stick in your window, things that let the public know that you're interested in this and that you are contributing to that. And also, similarly, to buy offsets, or RECs as they're called, renewable energy credits, to offset the carbon that you are emitting.
So what are some of your favorite resources? If people wanted to learn more, where would they go? Where would they get good information? Rachel, how about you first?
Well, I can't help it. They should go to our website, which is www.rnp.org, and there are all kinds of fact sheets about renewable resources and all kinds of information. The Energy Trust of Oregon is an entity that helps you do energy efficiency. They have a variety of different programs. They also work with people on renewable energy systems, small and larger renewable energy systems, and they're a great resource. You named all of the utilities as places where you could purchase green power. The Bonneville Environmental Foundation, also a local organization, invests in solar and wind resources, and you can buy credits from them as well.
Toby, what about you? What would you like to add to that long list?
Well, I'd recommend the American Wind Energy Industry Association, called awea.org. That's AWEA.org.
Okay. And what would I find there?
You'd find information on all of the state rebate programs. You'd find information on what's going on in each state for the utility action, and as well as what are the small wind turbine tax credits available for the homeowners. And I would add that even though institutionally that we may get 20% wind from the large wind farms, as a homeowner you can get 100%.
Yes.
It's all a function of sizing. So if it's sized properly, you're ready to go.
And the truth is that with increasing certainty over climate change, we're going to need everything. And so all kinds of resources will come to bear. Oregon is in a very good position to be able to pursue a lot of different kind of renewable resources, with wind playing the prominent role today.
What's your sense of what needs to happen with the distribution system? Because obviously we're talking about net metering and electricity, and I hear that that's sort of it's very old and not doing very well. So what do you think needs to happen?
As Toby mentioned, having resources that are right at the point of consumption, the distributed resources, are a really good thing, because you don't have to build any distribution lines and you don't have to build any transmission lines.
And you don't have the waste associated with
correct.
Line loss and that sort of
That's
thing.
correct. To the extent that we're going to be able to access new areas in the state or in the region that are renewable rich, we're probably going to need to build some new transmission lines, and that will allow a lot more resources to be able to be available to us, and hopefully over time we'll phase out the older technologies, the gas and the coal resources, and replace them with a variety of different kinds of clean resources.
So what's the future for small-scale wind? What gets your blood pumping?
Well, it's totally American. It's self-determination, it's self-reliance, and it's not impacting the world in a negative way for our children and their children. And really, this goes to the spirit of who we are, especially as Oregonians, I would say.
Pioneers.
Absolutely. You know, in the old days, you might not like your neighbor, but in the wintertime, if you needed help, you helped them, because next winter, it might be your kids that need help.
Right.
And that's a message that the whole world can learn from Oregon. And it's funny about the transmission issue, because in the panhandle of Texas, you have $2 billion worth of wind, but no power lines to get it to any market. So we can leapfrog, just like the mainframe computers were obsoleted by a personal computer, well, micros, remember Microsoft?
Briefly, yeah.
Exactly. Well, the same thing's happening in the power industry, that we're seeing this DG, this distributed generation, which doesn't require the wires. And therefore, you can move very quickly. So I see, in fact, a great leap coming with this empowerment and technology.
I've also heard there's a relationship between wind power and the so-called hydrogen economy, which never seems to quite reach us yet. But what's your sense there? Because wind power wouldn't necessarily have to be close to a transmission line if you can generate basically a fuel that could be carried someplace else, hydrogen. So do you see that happening anytime in the near future, or is that Star Trek-y stuff?
I'm a Star Trek fan, just like everybody else, and an optimist, and I think there are all kinds of good ideas out there. The benefit of having the traditional resources cost so much these days and increase in costs is that there's a lot of innovation in the market, and I think it's a really good time for us to see an explosion of different kinds of inventions and choose among them which ones we think are going to work best for us and what fits our lifestyle and what fits our economy and what fits our environment and what fits our quality of life.
You said something earlier about how rich Oregon is in its variety of renewable resources, and so it probably speaks to a future that has a lot more diversity in our portfolios than we currently have.
Yes, just like you want to have a diverse financial portfolio personally, you want to have a diverse portfolio for your energy resources, and Oregon is blessed with a tremendous endowment and diversity in different kinds of renewable resources. The wind blows, the sun shines, the rocks are hot for geothermal, the waves produce wave and tidal. There's biomass aplenty here, so we actually have the whole diversity of resources right here and available to us to be developed.
What I think is exciting is that it helps to reunify our state. You've had the urban and the rural split, and so talk a little bit about the experience that Sherman County has had. I think that's so exciting.
Sherman County was dead last in personal income in the state of Oregon. They were 36th out of the 36 counties, and the very first wind project that was built there in 2001 was a fairly small project, 25 megawatts. And that project alone contributed 10% of the county's overall tax revenues. So just one project made up 10%. Now they have about 500 megawatts installed in Sherman County.
To the tune of about $1 million per 100 megawatts that comes into the county general. So our whole county general is approximately $3 million, so it's almost 30% increase in the revenue for the county general.
I don't see any disadvantage. Here we put 5 turbines, 1.5 megawatt apiece, the first series on my land, and took out 1.48 acres. That was some of the worst land I got. Then the next series, we put 6 towers on. Some of the other part of the field was actually sort of worse, and it 1.8 acres. So, like the wife said, how much would we make on wheat on that? And I says, in 100 years we wouldn't make that. We got the first payment.
So the farmers make money because they get money for each turbine that's on their land. That helps keep them in the farming business and gives them a second source of income. It's good for the county because the county gets the tax revenues. It's good for the workers because they got something good that they can do right here in their county. The schools are trying to train people now into these kinds of technologies, so it's really working together very well.
And it's all that funding is going to support the schools. I think it's important when they do wind projects to do them in a way that the community benefits, not just one landowner who happens to have own the land on the windy ridge. I think it's important that it happen in ways that the whole community
right. I'm
benefits.
predicting that Sherman County is going to have the best schools in the state.
Especially per capita, because they're one of the smallest
right. They want people who are working on these projects to actually live in Sherman County and build houses and build a life there. And I think they're probably going to succeed. They're building for the long term. They're using their revenues logically and trying to spread them out so they have a lot of things to offer the next generation.
Well, this is such a great show. I'm sorry that we're running out of time here, but it was really wonderful to hear all of the exciting things that are happening. Thank you both so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And we want to invite our audience to join us next month when we'll be talking about water quality, drinking water, some of the recent regulation changes from the EPA and how it's going to impact us as consumers. So water is going to be just as important as wind and energy in the next few years.
And be sure to remember that you can watch these shows on sustainabletoday.org and recent shows. And if you'd like to volunteer, please let us know. Remember, it starts with you. I'm Darcy Hitchcock.
And I'm Marcia Willard, and we're bringing you the tools that you need to become sustainable today.
There's a big, beautiful planet in the sky. It's my home. It's where I live. You and many others live here too. The earth is our home. It's where we live. We can feel the power of the noonday sun, a blazing ball of fire up above, shining light and warmth enough for everyone, a gift to every nation from a star. There's a big, beautiful planet in the sky. It's my home, it's where I live. You and many others live here too. The earth is our home, it's where we live. La 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 la. Of power in our lives, offering another way to fill our needs, nature's gift to help us carry on. There's a big, beautiful planet in the sky. It's my home, it's where I live. You and many others live here too. The earth is our home, it's where we live. Yes, there's a big, beautiful planet in the sky. It's my home, it's where I live. You and many others live here too. The earth is our home, it's where we live. Oh, a big, beautiful planet in the sky. My home, it's where I live. You and many others live here too. The earth is our home, it's where we live. Oh.